The atmosphere in the roadside diner was thick with the scent of cheap grease and the low hum of the ceiling fan until the door creaked open, pulling every eye toward the entrance. A man, rugged, disheveled, and draped in a torn hoodie, stumbled inside, his presence a sharp, jagged contrast to the clean, orderly rows of booths. Danielle Brooks noticed him immediately, shifting 2-year-old Malik higher on her hip as she adjusted her neat blue uniform. While other customers turned away in discomfort, Danielle's gaze remained steady, watching the stranger with a resolve that masked her own bone-deep exhaustion. The man, Jonathan Reed, slumped into a stool at the counter, his face unshaven and his posture defeated. He appeared dehydrated, almost overwhelmed by the simple act of sitting down. Danielle approached him, not with the hesitation the manager expected, but with a composed dignity that seemed to fill the space between them. On her wrist, a striking gold watch caught the overhead light, a silent, gleaming contradiction to her modest service role. Jonathan leaned forward weakly, his voice a mere rasp as he asked for nothing more than a glass of water. From behind the counter, the manager's eyes narrowed, a silent warning already forming. "Don't waste time on a man who can't pay." Danielle heard the unspoken threat, yet she didn't flinch. She extended a steady hand, offering a clear glass of water to the man everyone else had already dismissed. Neither the manager nor the whispering patrons knew that this disheveled stranger was Jonathan Reed, a billionaire CEO executing a silent test inside his own franchise. He watched Danielle carefully, noting how she balanced the weight of her curious son, while never letting her professional grace slip. He saw the slight tremble in her hands as she worked, a sign of the double shifts she took to keep Malik fed. Yet her voice remained soft and respectful. The test reached its peak when the manager finally stepped forward, his voice a sharp blade cutting through the quiet as he demanded Danielle stop serving charity and get back to paying customers. Jonathan waited, his calculating mind expecting her to snap, to plead, or to turn her back on him to save her job. Instead, Danielle did something that left the powerful man speechless. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the sandwich she had packed for her own lunch, and placed it quietly next to the water. "Dignity isn't something you buy," she said, her voice calm and unwavering even as the manager reached for her name tag. "And hunger doesn't wait for a paycheck." Jonathan sat in stunned silence, realizing that in his search for character, he had found a woman who possessed a wealth his billions could never touch. He watched as she was ordered to pack her things, her son clinging to her shoulder, unaware that the homeless man he had just fed was about to change their lives forever. The fluorescent lights of the diner flickered with a rhythmic hum that seemed to sync perfectly with the throbbing in Danielle's temples. It was only noon, but the shift from hell had already earned its name. The air was thick with the smell of burnt decaf and the clatter of silverware, a sensory overload that Danielle had learned to tune out after years of hard shifts. She moved with a practiced, upright composure, balancing 2 plates of greasy breakfast specials on her left arm while Malik, her 2-year-old, clung tightly to her hip. Every few steps, he shifted his weight, his small hands bunching the fabric of her neat blue uniform as he watched the world from his mother's shoulder with wide, curious eyes. The diner was packed, a chaotic rush of travelers and locals that left Danielle with no time to breathe. Between scribbling orders and refilling coffee, she kept a constant, wary eye on the corner where Malik usually sat. Today, however, he was too fussy to be left alone, and the fear in her eyes was palpable every time she caught the manager's silhouette behind the counter. Mr. Henderson, a man whose empathy had long ago been replaced by a ledger of profit margins, watched her every move with silent judgment. "This isn't a daycare, Danielle." Henderson's voice sliced through the noise, sharp and devoid of warmth. He leaned over the counter, his eyes darting toward the child as if Malik were a stain on the polished tile. "The customers are paying for service, not to watch a single mom struggle through her life's mistakes. If that kid makes one peep, you're both out on the street." Danielle swallowed the lump in her throat, her expression remaining calm but firm as she refused to let his bitterness break her resolve. She didn't respond with anger. Instead, she adjusted Malik gently and offered a trained smile to a nearby table, hiding her exhaustion behind a mask of professional grace. She knew the stakes. If she lost this job, the stability she fought for every day would vanish. Her hands trembled slightly as she refilled a glass, the weight of the apron feeling heavier with every passing minute. Despite the rush growing around her and the manager's constant, mocking whispers, Danielle never once allowed her voice to lose respect or her service to falter. She was a woman built from years of surviving hard realities, and today was just another storm to weather. Little did she know, the door was about to open for a man who would turn this routine struggle into a test of the soul. The bell above the door gave a weary, rusted clang, momentarily cutting through the din of clattering plates and Henderson's sharp commands. A man stumbled in, his presence immediately dragging the room's energy into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. He was draped in a salt-stained hoodie, the fabric torn at the seams, and a grime-streaked beanie pulled low over his brow. This was Jonathan Reed, though to the eyes of the diner, he was merely a ghost of the streets. He didn't look at the menus or the people. He simply slumped into a corner booth, his body sagging as if the air itself had become too heavy to support him. His face was a mask of exhaustion, unshaven and pale, with a thin bead of sweat tracing a path through the dust on his temple. Danielle felt Malik tighten his grip on her neck, his small body sensing the shift in the room. She didn't look away. While other patrons shifted in their seats, creating a physical barrier of distance, Danielle felt a familiar pull of empathy. She saw the way the stranger's hands trembled against the tabletop, not from vice, but from a profound bone-deep depletion. "Don't even think about it, Danielle," Henderson hissed, leaning over the counter as he polished a glass with aggressive, jerky motions. "That booth is for paying customers, not for strays looking for a place to rot. He doesn't get a menu. He doesn't get a greeting. If he's not out of here in 2 minutes, I'm calling the police." Danielle looked at her manager, then back at the man who looked as though he might slide onto the floor at any moment. The gold watch on her wrist, a remnant of a life before the struggle, caught the light, a silent reminder that fortunes can turn in a heartbeat. She ignored Henderson's glare, her steady resolve acting as a shield for both her son and her own conscience. With Malik still balanced on her hip, she approached the booth with a pitcher of ice water and a clean glass. She didn't offer the pitying look the man likely expected. Instead, she provided the same composed, professional courtesy she gave to the town's wealthiest regulars. As she poured the water, the man looked up, his eyes bloodshot and searching. He didn't see a waitress looking for a tip. He saw a woman whose dignity wasn't for sale. "Just water," Jonathan rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Take your time," Danielle replied softly, her voice a calm anchor in the middle of the manager's rising storm. She set the glass down within his reach, her eyes meeting his with a silent promise that, in this corner of the world, he was still a man. The cool condensation on the glass did little to mask the hollow sound of Jonathan's stomach, a low growl that Danielle heard even over the midday rush. She watched as he gripped the water with both hands, his knuckles white and trembling, drinking with a desperation that spoke of more than just thirst. He was a man who had clearly forgotten the feeling of a full stomach, his eyes darting toward a neighboring table's half-eaten burger with a look of raw animal hunger that he tried and failed to hide. Danielle felt Malik shift on her hip, his small hand patting her shoulder. She knew that look. She had seen it in her own mirror during the weeks when the tips were low and the rent was high. Across the room, Henderson's eyes were like flint, his mouth tight as he tapped his watch. He was waiting for the slightest excuse to explode, his posture radiating a silent command to move the problem along. Danielle knew that offering the man a menu would be the final straw for her manager, and she couldn't afford a scene that might end in her being escorted out. She turned back to the counter, her mind racing. Tucked away on a small shelf behind the soda machine was a brown paper bag. Her own lunch, a simple ham and cheese sandwich she had prepared that morning to save the $5 a diner meal would cost. It was all she had to get through the rest of her 12-hour shift. Moving with a deceptive calm, Danielle set Malik down on a stool for just a moment, shielding him with her body as she reached for the bag. She quickly wrapped the sandwich in a thick white linen napkin, making it look like nothing more than a bundle of extra cutlery. She approached Jonathan's booth one last time, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You're going to need more than water to get where you're going," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She placed the napkin-wrapped bundle on the table, sliding it toward him with a subtle movement of her hand. Jonathan looked at the bundle, then up at Danielle. For a second, the billionaire mask slipped entirely, replaced by a look of profound, speechless shock. He knew what she was doing. He saw the way she glanced back at her manager, the way she protected her child, and the sheer risk she was taking for a stranger who had nothing to give her in return. "Eat it quickly," she added with a firm, steady resolve, "before he sees." She didn't wait for a thank you. She turned away and scooped Malik back into her arms, her upright posture projecting a quiet confidence that betrayed none of the terror she felt. She had just given away her only meal and likely her job, all to feed a man she didn't know, simply because his dignity mattered more to her than her own comfort. The heavy silence that followed Danielle's gesture was shattered not by words, but by the sharp rhythmic slap of leather soles against the linoleum. Henderson had moved from behind the counter with a speed born of malice, his face a contorted mask of industrial-grade fury. He didn't look at the disheveled man in the booth. His eyes were fixed entirely on Danielle, pinning her against the reality of her own desperation. "I saw that, Danielle," he hissed, his voice low and vibrating with a cruelty that made Malik bury his face into the crook of her neck. He stepped into her personal space, the smell of stale tobacco and cheap cologne invading the small pocket of peace she had tried to create. "I told you no charity. I told you no handouts. And yet you think you can take food from my kitchen, food I pay for, and hand it to a piece of trash that doesn't belong in a seat a paying customer could be using." Danielle stood her ground, her spine as straight as the iron rods that held the diner's foundation together. "It was my lunch, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor against his rising tide. "I didn't take a dime from you. I gave him what was mine to give. In my diner, nothing is yours." Henderson roared, the sudden volume causing a nearby patron to drop a fork. He jabbed a finger toward the door, then toward the blue apron tied around her waist. "You think you're so righteous? You think you can run a social experiment on my clock? You've been a liability since the day you started dragging that kid in here, and this is the end of the line." He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowed into slits of cold glass. "Here is your ultimatum, Danielle. You walk over to that booth right now, you grab that sandwich back, and you throw that man out onto the sidewalk where he belongs. Or you take off that apron, hand me your name tag, and you walk out that door with him. No references. No final check until I audit every scrap of bread you might have stolen." Danielle looked at Jonathan, who sat motionless, the napkin-wrapped sandwich still clutched in his trembling hands. Then she looked at the door, where the afternoon sun hit the pavement, a world that felt cold and indifferent. She felt the weight of Malik on her hip, the small heartbeat against her own, and the crushing realization that her survival depended on this man's cruelty. The stakes were no longer about a meal. They were about the very soul she refused to surrender to a manager who measured humanity in cents. The air in the diner felt as though it had been sucked into a vacuum, leaving only the sharp, jagged edge of Henderson's ultimatum. Danielle looked at the man in the booth, a stranger she had fed with her own hunger, and then at the man standing before her, who owned the floor beneath her feet but none of the grace she carried within her heart. She felt Malik's small fingers tighten against her shoulder, a silent plea for safety that resonated in the very marrow of her bones. For a heartbeat, the image of her empty cupboard flashed through her mind, the looming rent, and the terrifying uncertainty of tomorrow. But as she looked back at Jonathan, seeing the shock and the quiet recognition in his eyes, she realized that some debts are paid in spirit, not in currency. Without a word of anger or a tremor in her hand, Danielle reached behind her back. The knot of her blue apron gave way with a soft, final sigh. She pulled the fabric over her head, folding it with the same meticulous care she had used on her first day, as if the garment itself still deserved the respect she was being denied. She placed the folded apron and her name tag on the counter next to Henderson's trembling hand, her posture upright and composed, projecting a quiet confidence that seemed to dwarf the manager's petty rage. "I won't be throwing anyone out, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying across the silent diner like a bell. "Because a job is something you do, but who you are is something you keep. And I'd rather walk out of here with nothing than stay here and lose my soul." She turned toward the booth, offering her free hand to the disheveled man. Jonathan stood slowly, his eyes searching her face for the resentment he expected, but finding only a calm, fierce resolve. He took her hand, his own rough skin a contrast to the striking gold watch on her wrist, the last heirloom of a dignity that refused to be auctioned off. Together, the waitress, the child, and the stranger walked toward the exit. The bell chimed one last time as they stepped out into the afternoon sun, leaving behind the heavy silence of the diner and the judgmental whispers of the crowd. Danielle didn't look back at the life she was leaving. She looked forward, her son's hand wrapped tightly around her fingers. She had chosen dignity over dollars, unaware that the man walking beside her in tattered rags was about to rewrite every chapter of her future. The gravel of the parking lot crunched under their feet, a harsh grounding sound that seemed to punctuate the finality of the diner's closing door. The afternoon sun was unforgiving, casting long shadows across the pavement where Jonathan Reed's luxury car sat idling nearby. Though to Danielle, it was just another piece of a world she no longer belonged to. She stopped near the edge of the lot, shifting Malik's weight as the toddler rested his head against her shoulder, his eyes drooping from the sudden change in atmosphere. Beside her, the man in the tattered hoodie stood in the light, his rugged appearance and dirty clothes making him look even more out of place in the bright, open air. Jonathan turned to her, the vulnerability in his slumped posture beginning to give way to an intense, searching curiosity. He looked at her worn blue uniform, then at the child, and finally at the steady, fearless resolve in her eyes. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of her sacrifice. "Why?" he rasped, his voice stronger now but still laced with disbelief. He gestured vaguely back toward the diner where Henderson's shadow was still visible through the glass. "You had a job. You had a way to feed your son. You gave it all up for a man who couldn't even pay for a glass of water. Why would you risk everything for me?" Danielle looked down at Malik, then back at Jonathan, her expression calm and intentional. There was no regret in her gaze, only the quiet confidence of a woman who knew the true value of what she carried. The gold watch on her wrist caught the sun, a gleaming symbol of a dignity that remained untouched by her poverty. "A glass of water costs nothing, but a soul costs everything," she said softly, her voice steady and carrying a weight that seemed to shake Jonathan's very foundation. "I've spent my life being measured by what I don't have, but I refuse to let someone else decide who I am. If I had turned you away to save that job, I wouldn't have been able to look my son in the eye tonight." Jonathan remained speechless, his calculating mind silenced by a brand of wealth he hadn't prepared for. He saw the exhaustion in her hands, yet he heard only the strength in her words. In that moment, the test he had devised felt hollow and small. As Danielle turned to begin the long walk home, Jonathan stood in the silence, making a silent promise to himself that the dignity she had protected today would be the very thing that rebuilt his own world. The morning sun filtered through the thin, frayed curtains of Danielle's small apartment, casting a pale light over the worn linoleum of her kitchen table. The silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of Malik, who was still asleep in the small bed nearby. Danielle sat motionless, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea as she stared at the object resting on the table before her, the striking gold watch. It was a family heirloom, a gleaming remnant of a time when her name stood for something more than a line on a service schedule, and it was the only thing of true value she had left. She traced the delicate engraving on the back of the watch, her fingers trembling slightly from the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Yesterday's resolve had been fierce and righteous, but the cold reality of the morning after was far more demanding. She was now a mother without a paycheck, a woman whose dignity had cost her the very stability her son required. The rent was due in 3 days, and the meager stash of coins in her jar wouldn't even cover the groceries for the week. For a brief moment, Her chest tightened with a deep, familiar disappointment. She thought of the homeless man she had fed, wondering if he was even now wandering the streets, unaware that his survival had triggered her own downfall. She looked at the watch, its gold surface reflecting the sunlight with a quiet, stubborn brilliance. Selling it would pay the rent for months. It would buy Malik new shoes and stock the pantry until she could find another shift. But letting go of it felt like surrendering the last piece of herself that hadn't been touched by the struggle. "Dignity does not beg for sympathy," she whispered to the empty room, her own words from the parking lot echoing in her mind. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to break her composure. She wasn't just deciding whether to sell a piece of jewelry. She was deciding if the pride she had defended yesterday could survive the hunger of today. Somewhere across town, the man she had saved was shedding his tattered hoodie for a $5,000 suit, preparing to return for the woman who had treated him like a king when he looked like a beggar. But in the quiet of her kitchen, Danielle only saw a ticking clock and a choice that felt like a sacrifice. She gently pulled the watch closer, her resolve hardening even as her heart ached with the uncertainty of what was to come. The morning quiet at the diner was shattered by a low, mechanical rumble that vibrated through the cracked floorboards and rattled the sugar shakers on the counter. Henderson looked up from his ledger, his brow furrowing as he watched a fleet of 3 obsidian black SUVs pull into the dusty lot with military precision. They didn't park so much as they occupied the space, surrounding the entrance like silent sentinels. The regulars grew quiet, their forks suspended midair as the heavy doors of the lead vehicle swung open. A man stepped out, but he was no longer the slumped, shivering ghost who had begged for water the day before. This was Jonathan Reed in his full terrifying element. He wore a charcoal gray tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light around it, his white shirt crisp and stark against a jawline that was now clean-shaven and set with lethal intent. Gone was the torn hoodie and the desperate gaze. In their place was a man of peak status, projecting a power so absolute it made the diner's walls feel flimsy. Henderson scrambled to the door, his predatory sneer replaced by a frantic, sweating obsequiousness. He smoothed his stained apron, ready to greet what he assumed was a high-level corporate inspection. "Welcome, sir. I didn't realize we were expecting." Jonathan didn't wait for him to finish. He walked past the manager as if the man were made of glass, his polished Oxfords clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. He stopped at the very booth where he had sat in rags, his eyes scanning the room for the only person who had seen the man beneath the suit. He saw the empty counter where Danielle should have been, the absence of the woman in blue feeling like a physical ache in the room. "Where is she?" Jonathan asked. His voice wasn't a rasp anymore. It was a calm, low-frequency command that caused the manager to stammer. "The girl? Danielle? I had to let her go, sir," Henderson chirped, trying to reclaim his authority. "She was stealing, bringing her kid in, serving bums for free. I ran her out yesterday. Standard procedure for maintaining the brand's integrity. You understand." Jonathan turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Henderson with a cold, predatory focus that made the manager's breath hitch. "I understand perfectly," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am Jonathan Reed, CEO of this parent corporation. And the bum she served yesterday happened to be the man who signed your last 3 paychecks." The color drained from Henderson's face as the weight of the SUVs outside finally settled into his chest like lead. Jonathan pulled a leather folder from his jacket, his eyes never leaving the man who had mistaken poverty for a lack of worth. The silence in the diner was absolute, a heavy shroud that made the frantic ticking of the wall clock sound like a countdown. Jonathan Reed didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his presence and the cold reality of his revelation had already crushed Henderson's spirit. The manager stood frozen, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water, as Jonathan signaled to one of the men in the black suits. A leather-bound folder was placed on the counter, the very counter where Danielle had once carefully balanced her son while enduring Henderson's insults. "Your tenure at this establishment is over, effective immediately," Jonathan stated, his tone as sharp and final as a closing gavel. He didn't look at Henderson as the man was led toward the back office to pack his belongings in a daze of ruined ambition. Jonathan's focus remained on the empty space behind the counter, a space he intended to fill with something far greater than corporate greed. An hour later, the black SUV pulled up to the curb of a weathered apartment building. Danielle was standing on the sidewalk holding Malik's hand tightly, her eyes widening in disbelief as the man from the diner, now transformed into a titan of industry, stepped out to meet her. She instinctively reached for the gold watch on her wrist, but Jonathan raised a hand, stopping her with a gentle, respectful nod. "You told me that dignity does not depend on someone else's generosity," Jonathan said, stepping closer. He pulled a single notarized document from his jacket. "But justice does. You didn't just give me a meal, Danielle. You reminded me why I started this company. You protected the soul of my business when I had forgotten it existed." He handed her the paper, the deed to the diner, now legally registered in her name. Danielle's breath hitched, her eyes filling with tears that finally broke through her steady resolve. It wasn't just the keys to a building. It was the keys to her future. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He reached down, offering a small silver coin to Malik, who took it with wide, curious eyes. "I've also established a trust in Malik's name," Jonathan added softly. "A legacy for the boy who watched his mother choose her soul over a paycheck. He will never have to worry about the cost of an education, or the price of a meal." Danielle looked from the deed to the man who had once been a thirsty stranger, then down at her son. The gold watch on her wrist caught the sun, no longer a symbol of what she might lose, but a witness to what she had gained. She didn't fall at his feet. She simply stood tall, offering him a smile of steady respect. In that quiet street, a simple test had reached its end, proving that while money may measure wealth, only character defines a legacy.